The slaveholders controlled the fields, the barns, the smokehouse, and the company store. They never figured out how to control the woods. Persimmons ripened on the branch. Muscadines hung thick on the vine. Pawpaws dropped along every creek bed in the bottomlands. Freed black families across the deep South knew where every one of them grew. The fruit at number 7 grew in every bottomland forest and tasted like custard straight off the branch. Number 14 on this list was the first thing freed families pulled from the cold ground when nothing in the garden was ready. Sharecropping was built to keep freed families dependent. The forest made that harder. Hit subscribe because this list came straight from the woods. Here are 25 wild foods freed families foraged in the Deep South after emancipation. Number 25, lamb's quarters. This weed grew in every disturbed patch of soil across the Deep South, along fence rows, at the edges of plowed fields, and in the bare dirt around cabin doors. Freed families picked the young leaves before the plant flowered and cooked them the same way they cooked any pot green, simmered with a scrap of salt pork until the leaves went soft and dark. The flavor was mild and earthy, closer to spinach than to collards, and the leaves were tender enough that children could eat them without complaint. Lamb's quarters grew so aggressively that pulling it up one week meant a fresh crop the next. The plant needed nothing from anyone. It showed up wherever the ground was broken and kept coming back until frost. Number 24, wood sorrel. Small, clover-shaped leaves with a sharp, sour bite that made the mouth pucker on contact. Wood sorrel grew in shaded ground across the entire South, under trees, along creek banks, and at the edges of the woods where the sun barely reached. Freed children chewed the stems raw for the tart juice while they worked or walked. The leaves were tossed into a pot of greens to cut the heaviness of the fat, or brewed into a sour tea when nothing else was available to drink. The plant was too small to harvest in bulk, but it grew everywhere, and a handful added brightness to a meal that had none. Nobody planted wood sorrel, nobody weeded it, nobody owned it, and nobody could stop it from growing. Number 23, wild strawberries, smaller than a fingertip and sweeter than anything a seed catalog could promise. Wild strawberries ripened in late spring along sunny banks, open meadows, and the grassy edges of old fields. Freed families, especially children, gathered them by the handful, staining fingers and mouths red in the process. The berries were too fragile to store, so they were eaten on the spot or carried home in a cup and mashed into cornbread batter or stirred into fresh buttermilk. There was no way to cultivate them deliberately. They fruited where they pleased and disappeared into the grass the moment the season turned. A patch of wild strawberries in a known clearing was a family secret worth keeping, passed from mother to daughter without a word written down. Number 22, cattail. The tall brown-top plants that lined every pond, ditch, and wet, low spot in the South offered more edible parts than almost any other wild plant. Freed families pulled the young spring shoots from the mud and peeled them down to a white, tender core that could be eaten raw or sliced into a pot of stew. The roots were dug in fall and winter, dried, and pounded into a starchy flour that stretched cornmeal when the barrel ran low. The pollen from the green flower spikes, gathered by shaking them into a cloth, made a fine yellow powder that mixed into bread dough. The same plant that filled a ditch nobody wanted also filled gaps in a kitchen that had almost nothing on the shelf. Number 21, wild garlic. It pushed up through cold ground in late winter, weeks before anything in the garden stirred, and the smell gave it away before the leaves were visible. Freed families pulled the small bulbs from the forest floor and field edges and used them to season everything from potlikker to stewed game. The flavor was sharper than cultivated garlic, almost hot, and a few crushed bulbs could turn a bland pot of greens into something worth sitting down for. Wild garlic grew in dense clusters and came back year after year from the same spot. A family that knew where a good patch grew could walk out on a cold February morning with nothing and come back with enough seasoning to carry the kitchen until the planted onions were ready. Number 20, fox grapes. Smaller and more sour than their muscadine cousins, fox grapes grew on climbing vines through the trees along creek bottoms and forest edges across the upper South. The skins were tough and the seeds were large, but the juice was intensely flavored, dark purple and sharp enough to make the face tighten. Freed families gathered them in early fall and cooked the fruit down with whatever sweetener they had into a thick jelly that went on biscuits and cornbread through the cold months. The juice was also drunk straight, diluted with water, or left to ferment in a covered jar. Fox grapes were too sour for most people to eat fresh, but cooked down and sweetened, they produced a preserve no cultivated grape could match. Number 19, sumac berries. The fuzzy red clusters of staghorn sumac grew along roadsides, at the edges of cleared land, and in open sunny ground across the entire South. Freed families gathered the ripe berry clusters in late summer, soaked them in cold water, and strained the liquid through cloth to produce a tart, pink drink that tasted close enough to lemonade that it carried the same name in some communities. The drink was served cold when it could be, warm when it could not, and required no sugar to be drinkable, though a spoonful of honey or sorghum smoothed the edge. Sumac grew in places nobody planted it and produced clusters heavy enough that a single afternoon of gathering supplied enough dry berries to brew the drink for weeks. Number 18, dandelion greens. Every open yard, every roadside, every field left fallow for a season was covered in dandelions, and freed families picked them young before the flowers opened, when the leaves were still tender and the bitterness had not turned sharp. The greens were simmered with vinegar and salt pork, or wilted in a hot skillet with bacon grease poured over them. The roots were dug, scrubbed clean, dried, and roasted over coals until they turned dark and brittle. Ground into powder, they brewed into a bitter, dark drink that freed families used when real coffee was out of reach. The flower heads were sometimes steeped into a mild tea. The whole plant, root to blossom, produced something useful. Dandelion was the ultimate poor man's crop because it was not a crop at all. It was a weed that had already decided to grow, and all anyone had to do was bend down. Here is something the sharecropping system never accounted for. The contracts controlled the cash crop. The landowner set the price of flour, salt, and sugar at the company store. The debt ledger kept the family tied to the land from one season to the next, but the knowledge of which plants were safe to eat, which roots held starch, which berries ripened first, and which leaves would poison you if you picked them at the wrong time, that knowledge belonged to the people who carried it. It could not be written into a contract or deducted from a balance. Freed families across the Deep South inherited generations of plant knowledge that predated the plantation system entirely, stretching back through the Caribbean and across the Atlantic to West Africa. The forest was the one store where the prices were always zero and the shelves never emptied. Number 17, Jerusalem artichokes. These knotty brown tubers grew wild along riverbanks and at the edges of open ground, the underground storage of a tall sunflower that bloomed yellow in late summer. Freed families dug the tubers in fall and winter after the stalks had died back, scrubbed them clean, and sliced them thin for frying in a skillet or boiled them until they turned soft and slightly sweet. The flavor sat somewhere between a potato and a water chestnut, mild and crisp when raw, creamy when cooked. The plant spread aggressively underground, and once a family found a patch, the supply renewed itself year after year. Jerusalem artichokes were one of the few wild tubers in the Deep South that produced enough bulk to serve as a true starch in a meal. Number 16, watercress. In cold, spring-fed creeks and shallow streams across the South, dark green mats of watercress grew year-round, even through mild winters when nothing else was green. Freed families gathered it by the bunch, shaking the water off and eating it raw for the sharp, peppery bite, or tossing it into a pot of soup in the last few minutes of cooking so it wilted but kept its edge. Watercress was one of the few greens available in winter, and families who lived near a clean creek had access to fresh food when the garden was bare and the stored vegetables were gone. The plant grew in running water and cleaned itself. All a person had to do was reach into the cold water and pull. Number 15, maypops. The wild passion fruit of the American South grew on vigorous vines that climbed fences, wrapped around tree trunks, and sprawled along the ground in open fields and pasture edges. The fruit was small, about the size of a hen's egg, with a tough, wrinkled shell that gave way to sweet, aromatic pulp surrounding dozens of small seeds. Freed families ate the pulp raw, seeds and all, or strained the juice and mixed it with water for a drink. The flavor was tropical, tart, and fragrant, unlike anything else that grew wild in the region. Children broke the fruits open and sucked out the insides while walking or playing. The name came from the small popping sound the fruit made when stepped on. Maypops ripened in late summer, and a good vine in a sunny spot could produce dozens of fruits in a season. Number 14, wild onions. They were the first sign that the ground was waking up after winter. Before the dogwoods bloomed, before the garden soil was warm enough to plant, freed families walked into the woods and along creek banks in late February and found wild onions pushing through the leaf litter, their flat green tops visible from a distance against the brown forest floor. The bulbs were small, no bigger than a marble, but the flavor was concentrated and sharp, stronger than anything a cultivated onion could deliver. Pulled from the ground, shaken clean, and dropped whole into a pot of whatever was cooking, they transformed bland food into something worth remembering. Wild onions grew in dense colonies, and a family that knew where a stand returned each year had a reliable early season crop that required no planting, no watering, and no negotiation with any landowner. The greens were chopped fine and scattered over cornbread, mixed into scrambled eggs when eggs were available, or chewed raw by men and women heading into the field who wanted something sharp to start the day. In the mountain counties of the Upper South, a close relative called ramps grew in rich, shaded coves with a broader leaf and a stronger, wilder smell that lingered on the breath and in the clothes for days. Ramp season was an event. Families gathered in the woods together, filling sacks and baskets, and the smell of ramps frying in pork fat carried down through the hollows and told everyone within a mile what was for supper. A freed family with a good wild onion patch and a piece of salt meat had a meal that tasted like the promise of spring, even when frost still lay on the ground at dawn. Number 13, elderberries. The white flower clusters of the elderberry bush were visible from a distance in early summer, blooming along roadsides, creek banks, and the edges of open woods. Freed families gathered the tiny purple-black berries in late summer, stripping them from the stems by hand, a slow process that stained the fingers dark. The raw berries were tart and mildly bitter, but cooked with sweetener, they made a rich preserve. The juice was boiled down into syrup that families kept through winter for sore throats and chest colds. Elderberry wine, fermented in ceramic jugs and aged for months, was common at gatherings and celebrations. The bushes grew without tending and spread from the roots, and a stand along a familiar road returned every year with more fruit than the last. Number 12, chinkapines. Before the blight that destroyed the American chestnut reached the deep south, chinquapin trees, the chestnut's smaller cousin, grew throughout the upland woods and produced clusters of small, sweet nuts inside prickly burrs. Freed families gathered them in autumn after the burrs split open and the nuts dropped to the ground. The shells were thin enough to crack with the teeth, and the meat inside was sweet and starchy, eaten raw as a snack or roasted over coals until the surface darkened and the flavor deepened. Children competed with squirrels for the fallen nuts, shaking branches and filling pockets. Chinkapines were smaller than true chestnuts, but sweeter, and a family that gathered enough could grind the nut meat into a meal that stretched cornmeal in baking. The trees are far rarer today. The blight took most of them. Here is the part of the story that most food histories leave out. The foraging knowledge that freed families carried was not random guessing in the woods after emancipation. It was a system of plant knowledge built, tested, and passed down through generations under slavery and before that across the Atlantic. West African food traditions included the use of wild greens, tubers, and seeds gathered from the margins of cultivated land. Enslaved people applied that knowledge to an unfamiliar landscape and over 2.5 centuries mapped every edible thing the southern forest and waterway offered. When emancipation came, freed families did not suddenly discover the woods. They already knew them the way a farmer knows a field. The difference was that for the first time, what they gathered with their own hands belonged to them. Number 11, mulberries. Red mulberry trees grew wild across the deep south, and in late spring, the branches loaded heavy with dark, soft, oblong berries that stained everything they touched. Freed families gathered them by spreading a cloth beneath the tree and shaking the branches until the ripe fruit rained down. Children climbed the trees and ate them directly, coming down with purple hands and purple mouths and no intention of stopping. The berries were fragile and could not last more than a day, so they were eaten fresh, cooked into preserves, or baked into simple cobblers. The flavor was deeply sweet with almost no tartness. A productive tree could drop enough fruit in a single week to keep a family in sweetness for a month if the preserves were put up quickly. Number 10, pokeweed. This one came with a warning that every freed family knew by heart. Pick only the youngest spring shoots, no taller than a hand's length, before the stems turned red and the plant loaded itself with poison. The mature plant was toxic from root to berry, but the young shoots, harvested early, boiled in at least 2 changes of water with each batch poured off and discarded, produced a tender, mild green that was one of the first fresh vegetables available after winter. The greens were served with vinegar and a piece of salt meat, and in some households, they were fried in bacon grease after boiling. Pokeweed grew aggressively in disturbed soil, along barn walls, at the edges of gardens, and in any sunny spot where the ground had been turned. Getting the timing right was the entire skill. A family that knew when to pick and when to walk past had a reliable green that arrived before the garden was ready. Number 9, wild plums. The trees grew along fence rows, at the edges of old homesteads, and in the open ground between forest and field. Small and sour, the fruit ripened red or yellow in midsummer, and freed families picked them by the bucketful. Eaten raw, the tartness made the jaw clench. Cooked over a low fire with sorghum or honey and stirred until the fruit collapsed into a thick, dark preserve, the flavor turned rich and deep. That preserve went into sealed jars and lasted through winter without spoiling. Spread on cornbread or biscuits, it was the closest thing to dessert that a family could produce from something nobody had planted. The trees bore fruit year after year and spread along the margins of fields that no one cultivated. Number 8, sassafras. The roots of the sassafras tree smelled like root beer because root beer was originally made from them. Freed families across the deep south dug the roots in early spring, scrubbed and peeled the bark, and boiled it in water to produce a fragrant, reddish tea with a warm, spicy flavor that nothing else in the woods could match. The tea was drunk hot or cold, sweetened with honey when available, and given to sick family members as a warming tonic during cold weather. The young leaves were dried and ground into a fine powder called file, used as a thickener in gumbo along the Gulf Coast, giving the stew a silky body that tied the ingredients together. Sassafras trees grew in the understory of pine and hardwood forests, recognizable by their mitten-shaped leaves. A family that knew where a good stand grew could harvest roots and leaves for years without exhausting the supply. Number 7, pawpaws, the largest edible fruit native to North America, and almost nobody outside the rural South and Midwest has heard of it. Pawpaw trees grew in the understory of bottomland forests, along creeks and rivers, in the rich, moist soil beneath the canopy of taller hardwoods. The fruit was oblong, green-skinned, and unremarkable on the outside. Cut it open, and the inside told a different story. The flesh was golden yellow, soft and creamy, with a flavor somewhere between banana and mango, tropical tasting in a fruit that grew in temperate woods where winter brought hard frost. Freed families gathered pawpaws in September and October when the fruit dropped from the branches and gave off a sweet, heavy fragrance that carried through the trees. The fruit bruised easily and did not keep. It had to be eaten within a day or two of picking, which is one reason it never became a commercial crop and stayed invisible to markets and grocery stores. Freed families ate pawpaws, fresh, scooping the flesh with fingers and spitting out the large brown seeds. The pulp was stirred into cornmeal batter and baked into simple breads or mixed with buttermilk when it was on hand. Children knew the trees the way they knew the location of every good fishing spot and every blackberry thicket by memory and by season. Pawpaw groves were communal knowledge. A good stand near a creek was shared among families who all came back to the same spot each fall, and the abundance in a good year meant nobody left empty-handed. The tree asked for nothing except shade, water, and patience. Today, the pawpaw is sold as a rediscovered delicacy at farmers markets. Freed families never lost track of it in the first place. Number 6, wild honey. Bee trees stood in the woods like vaults waiting to be opened. Freed families located them by watching the flight paths of bees returning to the hive, following the line through the forest until it led to a hollow trunk or a gap in a dead limb. Cutting into a bee tree took nerve, timing, and smoke. A smudge fire lit beneath the opening drove the bees back long enough to reach inside and pull out sections of comb loaded with dark, heavy honey and pale wax. Wild honey in the deep south carried a flavor shaped by whatever the bees had visited: tupelo along the Gulf Coast, sourwood in the mountains, clover and wildflowers in the Piedmont. Each tree produced honey that tasted like the ground around it. The wax was saved for candles and waterproofing. The honey stretched across months, drizzled on cornbread, stirred into tea, or eaten straight from the comb. Number 5, blackberries. The thorny canes grew along every roadside, fence line, and forest edge in the deep south, and by midsummer, the berries hung in heavy clusters, dark and shining, daring anyone to reach past the thorns. Freed families gathered blackberries by the bucket, arms scratched and stained. The berries were eaten fresh, baked into cobblers with a simple biscuit dough on top, or cooked down into a jam so thick it held its shape on a knife. Blackberry cobbler, baked in a cast iron skillet over coals, was one of the simplest and most satisfying things a family could put together from foraged fruit and pantry scraps. The canes cut to the ground one year grew back twice as thick the next. A good blackberry patch was permanent and free. There is a reason these foods have faded from most American tables. The forests still have pawpaws. The roadsides still have blackberries. The creeks still hold watercress. What changed was not the land, but the way people lived on it. As freed families and their descendants moved into towns and cities, as the Great Migration carried millions of Black Southerners north to Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, and west to California, the daily practice of walking into the woods for food went quiet. Grocery stores replaced the forest, wages replaced the gathering, and the specific place-bound knowledge of which creek had watercress and which hollow held the best pawpaw grove stayed behind with the generation that never left. The food is still growing. The knowledge of where to find it is what most people lost. Number 4, black walnuts. The hard-shelled nuts of the black walnut tree dropped in autumn across the entire South, and freed families gathered them from the ground, hold them by stomping off the thick green outer casing, and spread the inner shells to dry. Cracking a black walnut required force. The shells were among the hardest of any nut, and the meat came out in small, irregular pieces, picked free with a knife point or a bent nail. The flavor was intense and earthy, far stronger than the English walnut sold in stores today. Freed families stirred the nut meat into cornbread batter, pressed it into candy with sorghum, or ate it plain as a dense, filling snack. The stain from hulling turned hands and cloth dark brown and did not wash out for weeks. Number 3, wild pecans. The native pecan trees of the Deep South were not the cultivated, thin-shelled varieties planted in commercial orchards today. Wild pecans had smaller nuts with thicker shells, but the meat was richer and more intensely flavored, with a sweetness that grafted varieties have long since smoothed away. Freed families gathered them in late fall after the first hard frost knocked the nuts from the branches, filling sacks that were carried home and stored in a dry place for winter. The nuts were cracked on a flat rock and eaten by the handful, stirred into porridge or pressed to release a pale oil for cooking. A single mature pecan tree could drop enough nuts to carry a family through the cold months. The trees grew along rivers and bottomlands, and in those years they belonged to whoever got there first. Number 2, muscadine grapes. Thick-skinned, musky, and intensely sweet, muscadines grew wild on vines that climbed through the trees along every creek bottom and forest edge in the Deep South. The fruit was larger than any other wild grape, sometimes nearly the size of a marble, and the skin was tough enough that eating one meant biting through a shell to reach the sweet, aromatic pulp inside. Freed families gathered muscadines in late summer and early fall, filling buckets from vines that hung so heavy the branches sagged under the weight. The grapes were eaten fresh, popping the skins between the teeth and swallowing the sweet center whole. They were cooked down with sugar or sorghum into a thick, dark preserve that lasted for months in a sealed jar. Pressed and strained, the juice was drunk fresh, boiled into syrup, or left to ferment in covered crocks into a wine that every community in the Deep South knew how to make, and most communities made every autumn without discussion. The flavor was nothing like the grapes sold in stores. Muscadines tasted like the woods they came from, wild, sweet, and musky, with a perfume that filled a room when a bucket of them sat on the kitchen table. The vines lived for decades, sometimes for what seemed like forever, and a good vine discovered by one generation was harvested by the next and the next after that. Freed families treated muscadine vines the way they treated bee trees and pawpaw groves, as landmarks on a private map that the family carried in memory and passed to its children. No fence could hold a muscadine vine. No deed of ownership applied to the fruit it dropped on the forest floor. In a system built to keep everything of value in the landowner's hands, muscadines hung on the vine for whoever had the knowledge to find them. Number 1, persimmons. They hung on the tree long after the leaves had fallen, bright orange against bare branches, visible from a distance in the late autumn woods. Eaten too early, before the first hard frost, the fruit was so astringent it pulled the inside of the mouth together and refused to let go. Eaten at the right moment, after the cold had broken down the tannins and the fruit had softened almost to the point of falling, a ripe persimmon was pure sweetness, honey and apricot and brown sugar all at once. Freed families knew the timing the way they knew every other rhythm of the southern year. They waited, they checked the trees, and they brought their children along and showed them how to test the fruit by touch, by color, by the give of the skin under a thumb. The persimmon taught patience. It punished anyone who rushed, and it rewarded everyone who understood that the best food does not arrive on a schedule. It arrives when the season says so, and the only thing required is the knowledge to recognize the moment. Number 23, fatback and grits. Fatback was a slab of pure fat cut from the back of a hog. It wasn't bacon, it wasn't salt pork. It was the cheapest cut at the store because most people with money wouldn't buy it. But for black families across the deep South, it was the foundation of nearly everything they cooked. You sliced it thin, rendered it in a skillet until the pieces turned into crispy golden chips, then poured the hot grease over a bowl of grits. The fat gave them a richness that butter never could. A pound of fatback cost 8 cents in 1942. A bag of grits cost a dime. Together, they held you through a full day of work in a cotton field. Your body needed that fat. It was fuel. Number 24, hominy. Freedmen soaked dried corn kernels in water mixed with lye made from hardwood ashes. The alkaline solution loosened the hulls and swelled the kernels to twice their original size. After rinsing, the pale, puffy grains were boiled slowly until they were tender enough to chew. Hominy was eaten as a side alongside pork or greens, fried in a skillet the next morning with whatever fat was available, or ground into grits when a hand mill could be found. The lye treatment did something that plain grinding could not. It released nutrients locked inside the corn that the body could not otherwise absorb. Freedmen did not know the chemistry. They knew the practice, passed down from generations of contact between enslaved Africans and native peoples in the South. The technique survived because it worked and because corn was the one crop a landless man could always grow. Fried apple turnovers owned the fall. The apples were always dried, never fresh. Dried fruit concentrated the flavor into something candy-like and held together without turning to mush. Families sliced their own from backyard trees each September, stringing them above the wood stove to cure. The dough was simple: flour, lard, salt, cold water, rolled thin and cut with the rim of a coffee cup. A spoonful of stewed apples in the center, edges crimped with a fork, and the whole thing slid into lard so hot it sealed the crust on contact. You never pierced the dough before frying. A single hole meant the filling leaked and the oil went dark. Kids learned that rule before they learned to read. These traveled in coat pockets to school, in baskets to church, in paper sacks to funerals. When bananas turned black on the counter, too soft for slicing, too sweet for anything sensible, that was exactly when they became perfect. Number 22, ash cake. Before there were ovens, before there were skillets in every kitchen, there was ash cake. You mixed cornmeal with water and a little salt, shaped it into a flat round, wrapped it in dampened cabbage leaves, and buried it directly in the hot ashes of a fire. 20 minutes later, you brushed off the ash and you had bread. This was the oldest form of bread in the American South. Enslaved people made it in their quarters at night after a full day of forced labor. They passed the technique down through generations, and it survived well into the 20th century in rural Mississippi and Alabama. A woman in Macon County, Alabama, told a WPA interviewer in 1937 that her family still made ash cake every night because they didn't own a stove. She was 72. She had been making it the same way since she was a child. Number 21, squirrel. In the woods and fence rows of the Deep South, squirrels were as common as daylight. Freedmen hunted them with traps, slingshots, and small caliber rifles when ammunition could be spared. The animal was skinned, cleaned, and stewed low and slow with onions and root vegetables until the small, tough muscles surrendered and the meat fell away from the bone. Squirrel stew was a weekday supper in freedmen's households near wooded land. The flavor was mild, closer to chicken than to the stronger wild game. A single squirrel was not much, but a morning in the woods could produce 3 or 4, and that was enough for a pot that fed the family. Children learned to hunt squirrel before they learned almost anything else about putting food on the table. Long before beignets became the face of New Orleans, Black women walked the French Quarter at dawn carrying covered baskets, calling out in Creole, "Beautiful callus, still hot." These rice fritters were made from leftover cooked rice mixed with yeast, eggs, sugar, flour, and nutmeg, fried in deep lard until golden and dusted heavy with powdered sugar. The word traces to West African languages, the Yoruba akara and Nupe kara, both meaning fried cake, carried across the Atlantic by enslaved people who adapted the recipe to Louisiana rice. Under Spanish colonial rule, enslaved people could purchase their freedom, and callus became one of the ways Black women earned that price, selling fritters penny by penny. By the 1940s, only a handful of callus women remained. The beignet pushed them aside. No overnight yeast rise needed. A dessert that once bought people their freedom barely survives now in a few Creole cookbooks and the memories of families who remember the taste. If those peach pies belong to summer, number 21, black-eyed peas and rice. In the Deep South, this wasn't just a New Year tradition. This was a Wednesday night, a Thursday night, a meal that appeared on the table so often that children grew tired of it before they understood what it cost. A bag of dried black-eyed peas, a cup of rice, a chunk of salt pork, and an onion. You simmered the peas with the pork until they turned creamy and the broth thickened into something smoky and rich. You served it over rice. A single pot fed a family of 5 for 2 days. The peas came to America from West Africa, where they had been a staple crop for centuries. They thrived in southern soil. They grew fast. A 5-pound bag cost 35 cents in 1950. That was 5 meals. That was survival by the pound. Number 23, poke salad. Every spring, pokeweed pushed up through the disturbed ground along fence rows, barn lots, and the edges of plowed fields. The young shoots and tender leaves were one of the first greens available after a long winter of dry beans and salt meat. But pokeweed carried a problem. The plant was toxic if prepared wrong. Freedmen knew the method that made it safe. The leaves were boiled in a full pot of water, drained completely, boiled again in fresh water, drained again, and boiled a third time before they were fit to eat. After 3 changes of water, the greens were wilted down to a dark, soft mass that tasted mild and earthy. Fried in bacon grease with a little salt, poke salat was a springtime staple that cost nothing and grew without asking. The trick was knowing when to pick it. Young leaves were safe after proper boiling. Mature stalks and berries were dangerous, and everyone in a freedman's household learned the difference early. She mashed them while they were still hot. Sweet potatoes pulled from the oven, skins splitting, steam rising off the orange flesh. Mixed with flour, a crack of egg, nutmeg, grated fresh, and just enough sugar to let the potato lead. Fried sweet potato cakes had roots running to West Africa, where similar fritters called puff-puff were fried in palm oil at open markets. In the American South, the technique adapted to what grew in black family gardens: sweet potatoes by the bushel, shaped by hand, flattened into thick patties, and fried in lard until the edges crisped into a caramel dark crust, while the center stayed soft. The key was never over-mixing. You wanted flexi potato in every bite. Sprinkled with cinnamon and served hot, they showed up at Sunday tables and after-church gatherings. By the 1980s, boxed mixes replaced from scratch frying, and these quiet cakes slipped off the table without anyone asking for the recipe until it was too late. Number 19, crackling bread. When a hog was slaughtered and the fat was rendered down into lard, what remained were cracklings. Small, crispy, golden brown pieces of pork skin and fat that had given up their grease but kept their flavor. Most people treated them as a byproduct. Black families treated them as an ingredient. You folded the cracklings into cornbread batter and baked it. The bread came out dense, savory, and studded with little bursts of smoky pork in every bite. It was cornbread that could stand alone as a meal. During hog killing season, which came every December when the weather turned cold enough to keep meat from spoiling, families rendered lard in enormous iron kettles and saved every last crackling. Nothing went to waste. A single hog produced enough cracklings to flavor cornbread for months. That was the math. One animal, one December day, months of bread with substance. Here's something that gets lost when people talk about soul food as cuisine. These meals were never about taste first. They were about staying fed in a system designed to keep black families dependent and underfed. Sharecropping gave families a plot of land and took most of what grew on it. The landlord kept the cotton. The landlord kept the profit. What was left went to the commissary store, where prices were set by the same man who owned the land. Families paid more for less and still had to figure out how to feed 6 or 7 children on what amounted to almost nothing. Every meal on this list was an answer to that equation, not a recipe, an act of resistance. The women who stood over those skillets were not defeated. They were problem solvers. The food stayed simple because it had to be. The people who made it were not. Number 22, pig ears. After a hog was slaughtered and the hams, shoulders, and ribs were claimed, the ears were left behind with the rest of what most people considered waste. Freedmen took them. The ears were scrubbed clean, singed of any remaining hair, and simmered in a pot for hours until the cartilage softened and the skin turned tender and gelatinous. Some families chopped them and added them to stews. Others pickled them in vinegar with hot pepper and onion, storing the jars for weeks. The texture was unlike any other cut of pork, part silky, part chewy, with a richness that came from the collagen dissolving slowly during the long cook. A jar of pickled pig ears sitting on a shelf represented protein that required no ice, no smokehouse, and no rush to eat before it spoiled. Number 25, hoe cakes and cane syrup. This was the meal that started the day before the sun came up and ended it after the sun went down. A handful of cornmeal, a pinch of salt, and enough water to make a thick batter. That was everything. You poured it onto a greased skillet and cooked it until the edges turned golden and crisp. The name came from field workers who once cooked the batter on the flat blade of a garden hoe over an open fire. By the 1930s, most families had moved to cast iron, but the name stuck. Cane syrup was the sweetener of the rural South. Families in Louisiana and Mississippi pressed their own sugar cane every fall and boiled it into a thick amber syrup that lasted all winter. You drizzled it over the hot hoe cake, and that was breakfast. Sometimes that was supper too. A 10-pound sack of cornmeal cost 20 cents in 1938. For a sharecropper family of 8, this wasn't a choice, it was arithmetic. Number 25, parched corn. Before a freedman could grind corn into meal or boil it into hominy, there was an even simpler way to eat it. Dried kernels were spread in a dry skillet or scattered across a flat stone set over coals and stirred until they cracked open and turned brown. No fat, no water, no seasoning required. The heat transformed the starch into something crunchy, slightly sweet, and light enough to carry in a pocket or a cloth sack for days without spoiling. Parched corn was trail food, field food, and hunger food all at once. A man heading out before dawn to work land he did not own could fill a handful from the jar by the door and eat it walking. Children chewed it between meals the way later generations would chew candy. It was the simplest thing corn could become, and for freedmen who had nothing else ready, it was enough. Before donuts came in boxes, there were molasses, dough balls, small rounds of flour, egg, and dark molasses dropped by the spoonful into shimmering lard. They puffed golden and crisp outside while staying dense and chewy within, carrying the smoky sweetness only blackstrap molasses could give. During the Depression, when white sugar was beyond reach for most black households in the rural South, molasses kept dessert alive. A jar cost almost nothing and stretched further than anything in the pantry. Mothers in Alabama and Mississippi fried batches on Saturday afternoons, rolling the hot balls in whatever sugar they had. Sometimes brown, sometimes raw cane, sometimes nothing, because the molasses was sweet enough alone. Kids lined up at the stove with outstretched palms, burning fingers and not caring. What started as a way to make something from almost nothing became the treat kids begged for even when the pantry was full. Number 20, smothered rabbit. A man with a box trap and a patch of woods could feed his family for a week without spending a cent. Wild rabbit was free protein across the rural South, and black families knew exactly what to do with it. You cleaned the rabbit, cut it into pieces, dredged it in seasoned flour, browned it in a cast iron skillet, then covered it with onions and a little water and let it simmer until the meat fell off the bone and the onions dissolved into a thick brown gravy. In rural Mississippi, boys as young as 8 ran trap lines before school. They brought home rabbit, squirrel, and sometimes possum. Their mothers turned each catch into something that tasted like it belonged on a Sunday table. By the 1960s, as families moved to cities, the tradition faded. But in the deep country, there are still grandmothers who can smother a rabbit with nothing but flour, onion, and thyme. Number 20, salt herring. Barrels of salted herring arrived in the deep South by rail and by river barge from the Atlantic coast. The fish were cheap, heavily preserved, and sold in country stores where freedmen bought supplies on credit. A single herring was stiff as a board, crusted in salt, and had to be soaked in water overnight before it could be cooked. Once the salt was drawn out, the fish was fried in a skillet or simmered with potatoes and onion. The flavor was strong, briny, and unmistakably fishy. It was not a delicacy. It was a way to get animal protein on the table when fresh meat was out of reach and the nearest creek was fished out. Salt herring kept for months without ice. It traveled well, and a single barrel could feed a family through the leaner weeks of late winter when the smokehouse was empty and the garden had not yet come up. Fried banana fritters took overripe fruit and turned it into something golden, crisp, and impossibly rich. Mashed into batter with flour, a beaten egg, sugar, and cinnamon, then dropped in rounds into hot lard. The natural sugars caramelized against the oil, creating edges that crackled into the warm center. Caribbean influence ran deep. Plantain fritter versions existed across the islands, and as families from Jamaica and Trinidad settled in southern port cities during the 1940s and 50s, those recipes merged with African American frying traditions already old. Some cooks added vanilla. Others drizzled brown sugar dissolved in butter over the top. The whole thing cost almost nothing and used fruit headed for the trash, resourceful and indulgent in the same bite. Number 24, potlikker and cornbread. Your grandmother didn't throw away the liquid left in the pot after she boiled her greens. That liquid was the whole point. When you simmered collard greens or turnip greens with a piece of salt pork for 2 or 3 hours, the water turned into a dark, savory broth packed with every vitamin the greens had to give. They called it potlikker. Families drank it straight from a cup. They soaked cornbread in it until the bread fell apart and turned the bowl into a stew. Doctors in the 1930s found that families in the rural South who drank potlikker had lower rates of pellagra than those who did not. The science was in the broth. A pot of greens and a pan of cornbread fed a family of 6 for 15 cents. The potlikker was free. It was the most nutritious thing on the table, and it cost nothing at all. Every food on this list grew without being planted, ripened without being watered, and fed people who had been told they could not feed themselves. The forest did not ask who owned the field beside it. The creek did not check a sharecropping ledger before it grew watercress in the shallows. Freed families walked into the margins of a system designed to keep them hungry and came back carrying supper. Try gathering some blackberries this weekend if they grow where you live. Look up where the pawpaw trees still stand near your county. Drop the wild food your family still gathers in the comments. The woods have always been patient. They are still offering everything they offered then. The only question left is whether anyone still remembers where to reach.